Welcome back. We're going into Sumer tonight. Not the Sumer you half remember from whatever survey course you took, paragraph between Egypt and Greece that mentioned cuneiform and irrigation, and then moved on before you could register that those were, I don't know, world-altering things. Not that Sumer, the one that was alive, Borland, the one that watched the sky with genuine terror and genuine reverence, and didn't experience those as separate feelings. Here's what I keep running into every time I try to explain where we're starting. People assume the Greeks invented the whole project. Mythology, gods with personalities, divine drama, Olympus as the first address where anything supernatural ever lived. Like before Athens, there was just shrug, nothing. A pre-storied world. That's wrong. Greeks were handed something. They received it. Prime, break, time, 8.05s. They were brilliant and they transformed it. And they gave it a shape that survived long enough for all of us to recognize it. But they didn't originate it. Before Zeus, there was Enlil. Before Aphrodite, there was Inanna. And I'll say more about Inanna later. Much more, 'cause she demands it. Before Poseidon made the sea his territory, Enki had already moved into the water, made it his house, taken up residence in that place where the freshwater current pushes up against the salt and something strange and pressurized happens in the dark. He named it, breathed on it. The water already had a history before the Greeks arrived to tell us about water. So that's where we're going. Was Bide. 3,000 years before Homer was sitting somewhere trying to remember what he'd heard. We're going into clay, break, time, 0.05s. We're going into storms that had names and moons that were gods and air that was, apparently, occupied. Close your eyes if that helps. Don't. Let your hands go heavy, either way. Nothing to solve tonight. Before the cities, before even the idea of a city was available to anyone, the landscape between the Tigris and the Euphrates was wetland. Flat. Edgeless in a way that's hard to picture if you've grown up somewhere with hills. Worry. Two rivers coming down from unnamed mountains, spreading themselves across dark soil, reeds, woody. Massive flocks of birds moving through the reeds on missions that had nothing to do with human beings, because human beings weren't there yet. Then people came, somewhere around the 5th, 6th millennium, before our calendar. They came and they stopped. They decided, against what I'd consider reasonable judgment, break, time, 0.05s to stay. The rivers flooded unpredictably. The heat was severe. There was no stone, no timber, why no metal in this place. Nothing to build with that didn't have to be improvised or traded. You could do everything right and still watch the water come take it. Yet, the gravity of this particular mud, this particular sky, the way the flat horizon made the clouds feel personally addressed to you. Something held them, built with what they had. Mud bricks. Reeds. They dug channels to redirect water they couldn't control, borrow from it during drought, and deflect it during flood. Granaries. Temples. They built the infrastructure of a life that didn't want to be interrupted. Then, this part I find hard to describe exactly. Break, time, 0.05s. Not Not because it's complicated, but because it's so human. It almost embarrasses me. They built the explanations. You know the feeling. You've had it. The world goes too large and too silent and too obviously indifferent to your specific problem. And you need not religion necessarily, not anything formalized, just you need to believe the randomness has a structure, that the flood didn't just happen, that something chose. For the Sumerians, this wasn't philosophical, it was material. A failed harvest was starvation, not a setback, not a bad quarter. Starvation. Flood was annihilation. Stakes of the gods' moods were direct and physical and immediate in a way that makes our relationship to divine uncertainty feel almost. I was going to say something. I'll leave it. But I'll leave. They built the petitions into a system. Break time, 0.05s, Tonti. And the system had names. Let me collect the thread here, because I want to get this next part right. The name at or near the top was An, one syllable, barely a word. Sky, Sumerian. The word for sky and the word for God were the same written sign. A star pressed into clay. And this wasn't decorative. Quan An was the sky's own personhood. The sky understood as a being rather than a backdrop. Father of gods, father of the world order, origin point from which divine authority descended. He held the me. This is the part I always get stuck on, trying to explain why it matters. The me were tablets, essentially divine tablets, except tablet makes them sound small. They were the blueprints, music, kingship, the descent into the underworld, crafts of the smith, the scribe, the power of lament, which they considered a craft, break time 05s, which I think about more than I probably should. Truth, falsehood, both. Because whoever holds the architecture of civilization has to hold all of it, has to contain within the same hands the lie and the thing the lie deforms. Wasn't cruel. He wasn't absent the way a bad father is absent. He was distant like the sky is distant, always present, always actual, always exactly where it says it is, but too large to reach. Anyway, Enlil comes next, and Enlil is storm. I'm rushing past him slightly, I know, deserves more room. But Enlil is the kind of figure who, he's the executive. If you want a clunky comparison, one who takes the authority and holds in the abstract and converts it into weather, into wind, into the specific pressure you feel before rain. He ran things, Grogo, he was difficult, break time, 05s. He had a history with humanity that went in several bad directions, which we'll get to. The point right now is just the structure. And above, one lil, lateral, active, moving through the world. And then, Enki in the water, which was where the clever things happened, the inventions, the tricks, wade the narrow, saves. More on that too. Enki in the water, the deep current, fresh water pressing up through dark like. Okay, this is the clunky one, I'll admit it. Like a thought you've been suppressing that finally comes up anyway, because the pressure got too high. That's not quite right. I see what I meant, close enough to leave in. The sky, the storm, the water, that's the frame. That's what they stood inside of when they tried to pray, climbed the towers. The Ziggurats, break, time equals, or 5s. The tiered temples that you've seen in reconstruction images, if you've seen anything about this period. And they stood at the top in the wind, the priests, Wadi, and they listened. Not metaphorically, actually listened. For the voice that moved between planets. For whatever was on the other side of the noise. Whether they heard anything, I don't know. I genuinely don't know, and I find I can't say either way without lying slightly. But they kept climbing and held all of it. The me, the laws, the blueprints of everything. Held them in the high cold place where sky stops being anyone's sky and becomes just sky, permanent, final. The sky over no particular field, no particular face, turned upward with a specific problem. The idea of sky, always, chest, is moving more slowly now. You may have noticed, break time, 05s. The breath deepened somewhere in the last few minutes, without you deciding it should. The body does this. Here's something the mind hasn't processed yet, and it adjusts. And I think I don't know exactly why I find that worth saying, but I kept it. Below An was Enlil. And I want to be careful about below here, because in this cosmology that word doesn't mean lesser. It means placed, relocated, in a sacred arrangement, where position is function, and function is everything. Enlil was movement, and was the sky's permanence, the held breath, thing that doesn't shift. Enlil was what the sky does, the wind coming off the mountains in spring, when the ice finally breaks, carrying warmth and carrying violence, in the same gust, which anyone who has stood in that kind of wind knows is not a contradiction. He was the world's breath. Break, time, 05s, and breath, as you know right now, own breath, gone slow, and your hands loose. Breath is capable of gentleness and capable of other things. Nippur was his city, the religious capital, the center, not where the kings sat, but where authority was issued, where other gods came to have their power confirmed. His temple was called the Ekur Bodhi, House Mountain, built upward in tiers toward the place where the sky got close enough to almost touch, which is a description of every ziggurat, but felt truest of his. Kingship passed through Enlil. The divine assembly made decisions, but without Enlil's word, those decisions didn't hold. He was power, the working kind that actually moves through the world and flattens things, or builds them. He brought the flood, not identically the flood you know, break time 0.05s, but the one that the flood you know is partly remembering. In the Sumerian account, humanity had gotten too large, too loud. The noise of civilization, not cruelty, just noise, sound of people living in the persistent and slightly chaotic way that people live, was interrupting the gods' rest. Enlil couldn't sleep. Enlil, unable to sleep, sent pestilence, then drought, then famine. The people survived each one, rebuilt. The noise resumed, so he sent water to end the sound. I need to pause here, because this part keeps stopping me when I read it. The god of wind, of breath, of living air, force, that moved through the grain and lifted it, that carried seeds from one place to another, made the world's lungs work. That God looked at a world full of voices and decided the answer was silence. total silence. Point break time, U5s. The silence that comes after water has moved through everything. You've had a version of that feeling. Smaller, never acted on, wide. The wish that it would all just stop for a moment. Just go quiet. Just let you breathe without the noise pressing in from every side. That wish, God's authority and a God's scale. Given the power to actually do it. It almost worked, except Enki. Let that sit before I go further. Just the name Ki, God of fresh water, God of wisdom and craft, and I'm going to say trickster, but I mean it in a specific way. I mean inventive in ways that bent rules rather than broke them, which is a different thing and matters. He lived in the Abzu, fresh water beneath the world's surface, the aquifer, the sweet water, the Sumerians understood, was under everything. Invisible, essential, break time, EU5s. The source that springs came from, and wells drew from, and rivers were partly fed by, built his house there, in the deep current. And he watched, and he made things. And when the gods needed something solved, rather than decreed, they came to him, the one who warned Ziusudra, later Utnapishtim, later still, Oi, Noah, the names shifting as the story moved through cultures like water, moving through different soils and picking up different minerals, but staying water. Gods had agreed to keep the flood secret from humanity. Enlil had their word, so Enki went to Ziusudra's reed hut and he spoke to the wall, dressed the wall of the hut. He told the wall what was coming. He told the wall in careful detail how to survive it, kept his oath by the thickness of a reed wall, break time, by the technical fact that he was speaking to a structure and the man inside just happened to hear every syllable anyway. Griffend, this is the thing about Enki that I find. And I've read a lot of these figures, a lot of divine tricksters, across a lot of traditions, Hermes and Loki and Coyote and the rest. This is the thing that separates him slightly. He isn't mischievous. He doesn't trick for pleasure or chaos, finds the gap between the law and the right action, the gap that is sometimes very narrow, sometimes the width of one reed wall, and he moves through it sideways, quietly. He lets the protection happen through the story of something else, the thin wall, the dream, technically, the drextis to know one speech that saves everything, a god who understood that sometimes the most powerful move is the one that looks break time, X05s, from the right angle, like nothing happened at all, like a current running under everything, essential, doing its work, invisible until you need it, and then suddenly just there when you dig down far enough. That's clunky. I know that simile doesn't fully close, one steady. I'm leaving it anyway, because I've been trying to describe Enki for 10 minutes, and that's the closest I've gotten. Your jaw. Is it tight? It was probably tight before I mentioned it. Let it soften. Teeth slightly apart. Tongue resting, not pressing. That small unclenching, one you didn't know you were holding. Enki would have recognized that. The small release, Brudi. The thing that makes the whole structure fractionally less tense without announcing itself. He was that, the sweet water under everything, moving without permission, saving things through walls. Break time, 05s. Enki saved a man, a boat, animals, seeds, the accumulated memory of what the world had been before water took it. When the flood receded, and the man came out and made offerings, burned things, smoke going up. The gods gathered around that smell, and most of them felt something they hadn't anticipated. Regret, specific kind, that arrives only after the irreversible thing, when the world is empty and you understand for the first time what full had meant. One Lil was among them. He was moved. I won't say he apologized, because gods of that scale don't quite do that. But something in him shifted toward recognition, agreement formed. A promise, or near enough. The world would continue in the silence after the water. The wet, depopulated world, break time. 0.5s, tie heavy, with mud, and with something I keep wanting to name, and can't exactly. Some quality of aftermath, borrowed of having just barely survived a decision someone else made. The gods and humans worked out a new arrangement. The humans were still mortal. Gods were still gods. This is not a story about equality, but the relationship had been taken to its edge and almost broken there. What came back from that edge was different. The gods discovered they needed the noise, the offerings, smoke, and the temples, and the daily attention of human beings maintaining contact. Imagined they wanted silence, and the silence had arrived, and it was wrong. It was wrong in a way that apparently surprised them. I don't know why, I find that detail so affecting, but I do it. I've kept it every time I've written about this. Break 0.05s. The humans needed the gods too, though the shape of that need was harder to name. The stories, yes. The framework that said flood came. For this reason, here is how you survive. The next one. Calendar that told you when to plant and how to read the stars' positions as instructions, what the river's mood meant, and how to address it. Explanations that made the random feel not controlled, but legible, answerable to. They needed each other. Unequally, let me collect the thread here, cause I want to be precise about the temples. The temples were residences. This is the thing people miss, Quadi, or the thing that gets translated into something more familiar and therefore wrong. The god lived there. Break time equals 5s. Faspis, the statue of the god. And I want to be careful how I say this, because the usual framing flattens it. The statue was the god's body in the city, physical form the deity wore in that place. The priests and priestesses were household staff, servants of a resident with daily requirements. Every morning, the god washed the statue, anoint it with oil, dress it, bring food. Fine food, the best the city had, first fruits, animals selected for the purpose, fresh bread, strong beer, and set it before the presence and withdraw behind a screen. Give the god privacy to eat. Return later, take what remained, vine essence, having drawn from the offering what it needed, and distribute the rest to the temple workers and to the poor. The god ate, was clothed, slept in a house. In return, the city received order. Break time, ill 5s, it's 5s, the rivers at their proper levels. Rain arriving when it should, stars moving in patterns that could be trusted, tracked, used, or harvest sufficient to carry the city through winter and into the next planting, where I think something usually gets lost in translation. Not linguistically, hoary. I mean in the move from their world to ours, because we tend to read this arrangement as metaphor, as psychology, the way a culture processed anxiety about agricultural uncertainty, and maybe. But they did not experience it as metaphor. The relationship was material, factual, not a contract written anywhere but enacted in the morning, washing, the evening, meal, the festivals arriving at their appointed times, prayers that were maintenance work, not expressions of hope. Active upkeep of something load-bearing, break time, 05s. When it broke down, when a city fell, its temple burned, statue carried off by whoever had just won. The Sumerians read that as damage to the relationship. Something had gone wrong between the city and its god. The city had failed its obligations, or the king had, or the divine assembly had made a decision that no human petition could reach or alter. The way Ningal petitioned for her city and was heard and denied. The gods were present. The decision was final. The city rebuilt. Always rebuilt. Statue returned or was remade. The morning washing resumed, because a world where the gods were absent from it, wide, where the daily negotiation between human need and divine management had simply stopped. That was the thing that was unimaginable. The flood was survivable, since was not. Anyway, Nana was the moon. Say it quietly. Break time. The way you might say something true before you've decided whether to say it out loud. Nana, called sin in some traditions, worshipped under different names in different cities, but underneath all of it, Nana, the moon, son of Enlil, and Ninlil, born from a union that was itself a story of power badly used and consequences that didn't disappear, just transformed. The moon in Sumer was masculine. By notice, this still surprises people, though I'm not sure it should. Surprises people shaped by later traditions where lunar cycles belong to women, to tides, the body's rhythms, and the moon is feminine by such long assumption that the assumption feels like fact. In Sumer, a king, a slow king who crossed the sky each night in a boat, because the sky was a kind of water, a celestial river, and everything that moved across it sailed. Break, time, fives, and Nanavar sailed it with, I want to say with patience, but that's not quite right. Patience implies effort. With the absolute steadiness of something that has always moved this way and will continue. His phases made the calendar, waxing and waning, made the months, and therefore made time itself a thing that could be tracked, trusted, handed from one season to the next without losing count. The light he gave was enough to move by in the dark without burning. Enough and no more. That restraint, keep coming back to that. The moon gives you just enough. Nana, son of Enlil. His parentage already complicated, already carrying the weight of how he came to be. Which is a story I'm going to move through quickly, because it is a story about assault, and I find I can explain it accurately, or I can linger on it. And I'm choosing the former tonight. Just Enlil forced Ninlil, was tried by the gods and banished to the underworld. And Ninlil followed him. And from that following, from that complicated act of a woman who would not let even a banished god go alone into the dark, Nana was born. He carries all of that in him. Difficult origin. The mother who walked into the underworld and came back. The father who was powerful and wrong and was made to reckon with it, at least provisionally. He sailed his boat across the sky and gave the world its months. He gave time its shape. The way he did it, the slow, reliable cycling, full, then thinning, then gone, then returning. It's like watching something you're almost certain will come back, and then it does. The relief's disproportionate every time, and you know it's disproportionate, and you feel it anyway. Nana, the months, the counting, sky as water, and the moon moving through it, steady. On its way, somewhere it's always going. That doesn't stop. Quite. Nana's boat crossed the night sky, and the Sumerians found this comforting. That's the word I keep landing on. Comforting, which sounds small. The thing it was comforting against was enormous. The flood, the failed harvest, the river that rose for no reason and took everything. Against all of that, break time, 0.05s. The moon came back every 29 days, diminished to nothing, and then returned. It came back. You could plant by it, navigate by it, schedule the festivals that maintained the whole fragile agreement between humans and gods. Proof, in the most practical sense, that some things persisted. Nana was married to Ningal, Lady of the Great Lake. The hymns about their marriage are, I find this hard to describe without it sounding sentimental. Isn't what I mean. They're tender in a way the other hymns aren't. She lay beside him in the moonlit dark. She moved with him across the skywater forward. The moon, in the Sumerian understanding, was not alone up there. It carried its companion. Break time equals 5:05s. The light it shed on the sleeping world had in it something of what two people generate when they've been together long enough to stop performing for each other and just exist. Have that. Someone whose presence doesn't require a version of you. Someone beside whom you breathe at whatever pace your body wants, without accounting for it. Nana and Ningal had that. They crossed the night together and gave the dark world enough light to see by. Daughter was the reason no one in the ancient Near East could be comfortable about anything. Her name was Inanna Unidi. I need you to understand something before we go into her. There is no goddess in world mythology quite like Inanna. There are inheritors. Ishtar, nearly the same being in Babylonian tradition. Aphrodite, who carries several of her qualities. Astarte, Venus, break time, 0.05s, others down the chain. But Inanna herself, the one the Sumerians sang about in hymns composed by a woman named Enheduanna, who was herself one of the first named poets in recorded human history. I mention because it matters, because the voice that defined Inanna for us was a woman's voice, a specific woman's voice. That is not a small thing. That Inanna resists the comparison. Goddess of love, goddess of war, morning star and evening star both. Venus rises before the sun and is also the last light before full dark. And this double appearance was the point, was the whole structure of what she was. She lived at edges, dawn and dusk, the threshold moments when something is ending and something is beginning, and the direction hasn't declared itself yet. She was desire, break time, 805s. And I don't mean the word has gotten so small in modern usage, so narrowed down to candlelight and the pleasant anxiety of new romance, I almost don't want to use it. What she embodied was the wanting that moves through you before thought catches up. Brikai, the appetite that exists before justification. The force that makes you reach before you have consciously decided to reach sometimes moves your entire life before you have agreed to let it move. Old, animal, pre-rational. That was Inanna. And she was war, moment in battle, when the plan dissolves, and only the body's responses remain. The cold clarity of it. The rage that is somehow always mixed with grief. Sumerians saw something in the figure of the warrior that wasn't moral beauty. They were clear-eyed enough not to claim that, but an aesthetic one. Break time equal 5s. The terrible quality of a thing that has stopped holding back. And here is the part I find genuinely hard to articulate. I've tried several times. Those two things in the Sumerian understanding were the same thing, desire and war. Both were the unleashed force. Both exceeded their container. Both came from the same place in the chest. That place that is wild and directionless until it finds its object. Then it is absolutely focused and absolutely without mercy. Sumerians grasped something about human nature, that the force driving us toward each other in love, and the force driving us against each other in violence, share a root, run on the same fuel, that we still find difficult to say plainly. But they said it plainly. They built a goddess out of it. She was ambitious. She wanted more than she had. Always break time, 05s. This was her defining quality, the thing that set every story in motion, the restlessness that made her the most interesting being in their pantheon. She went to Enki's house, sat with him, drank beer through the long feast, drank him past the point of good judgment, and while he was incapacitated, she took the me, the divine laws, the blueprints of civilization, and steady. All of them, loaded them onto her boat, and sailed them back to Uruk before he recovered enough to understand what had happened. When he sent the creatures of the Abzu after her to take them back, she faced them down, everyone. She arrived home in triumph, with the laws of civilization in her arms, and she gave them to her city. The Sumerians did not make her repent this, wrote hymns about it, celebrated it. Her ambition was the whole point. Let me collect the thread here. Break time equal 5s. Because the next part is the one that has stayed with people for 4,000 years, and I want to give it the space it needs. Stomach is heavy, isn't it? The deep night heaviness. The body finally surrendered to horizontal, muscles gone loose, particular quiet of a body that has stopped anticipating the next demand. Let it settle. This part works better when you're not braced. Nana decided to go down into the great below, the Kur back. The Sumerians imagined the underworld as a vast dark city beneath the earth, a mirror of the living world, but wrong, depleted, a place where the dead went and became shadows of what they'd been, existing in something less than the fullness they had known. The underworld had a queen. Her name was Ereshkigal, Inanna's sister. Sit with that for a moment. Break time. Ill fives. 2 sisters. One commanded the sky and the surface of the world. One ruled the underground. Ereshkigal was power of a different kind. The power of endings, of necessary dark, of what remains when the bright, living parts have been stripped away. She had been thrown into the great below, hadn't chosen it, had been placed there by forces the text doesn't fully explain, which I think is intentional. Offering things in the oldest stories are presented as simply having been done, structural facts rather than events. And she ruled it because ruling was the only available response to a place she couldn't leave. Anyway, Inanna decided to visit. No one agrees on why. Some sources say she went to attend the funeral of Ereshkigal's husband. Some say she went for power because Inanna, being Inanna, break time, wanted dominion over the underworld in addition to everything else she already held. Some say she went because something waited for her there, some knowledge available only in the dark, and that her descent was courage rather than appetite, or was both, which seems most true to who she was. Before descending, she dressed in her full regalia, the crown of the step, the measuring rod and line, the stones of the mountains, the gold ring, breastplate, the pectoral, coal around her eyes. Every mark of her power and identity, everything by which she was recognizable as herself. She put it all on, and she walked down. At the first gate, the gatekeeper stopped her and took her crown. The second gate, the measuring rod. It the third, the stones. It the fourth, the ring. It the fifth, the breastplate. It the sixth, the pectoral. Break time. Equal fives. End. And at the seventh gate, the last one, the innermost, the garment covering her body entirely, passed through 7 thresholds, and at each one she was diminished. By the time she stood in the innermost chamber of the underworld, she had nothing. She was Inanna, but Inanna with every attribute removed. Everything that marked her as herself, as powerful as her, taken at each gate, one by one, and she'd had to let each one go to pass through. Ereshkigal looked at her, her sister, her dark reflection, the one who had also been stripped and placed somewhere without choosing it, and killed her, hung her corpse on a hook on the wall. The pause the story makes here that I find. I don't have good language for what this pause does. The narrative has to stop. No forward motion until someone comes to find her. Inanna, break time, 05s. The morning star, the goddess of desire and war, one who drank Enki under the table and faced down sea monsters and burned in the sky at the edges of day. Hanging on a hook in the dark, no one in the upper world knew yet. She had been wise enough to prepare for this. Before descending, she told her servant, Ninshubar, I don't return in 3 days. Go mourn for me. Make yourself filthy. Go to the temples, beat the drum, tear your clothes, Go to the fathers, Enlil, Nana, Enki, for them to come. Ninshubar waited 3 days, then did exactly what she'd been told. Enlil said no. Inanna descended of her own will, he said, walked into the land of no return, knowing it was called that. That was her choice, and the land of no return had rules that applied to everyone. He was unmoved, break time zeros, fives. It was I almost said something about a particular kind of institutional thinking, but I won't. Nana said no. His daughter, yes, but the underworld had laws. You didn't enter and then leave because you'd reconsidered. The rules held for everyone, even for his own. Enki said yes, of course he did. Enki, who spoke to walls so he could technically keep his oath, while actually breaking it in the direction of the right thing. Enki, who found the gap. He didn't send power down to retrieve her, scraped dirt from beneath his fingernail. Some translations say he made figures from the dirt. Under his fingernail is such a specific detail that I've never been able to decide if it's mundane or magnificent, but I kept it, and he created 2 small beings. No gender, no appetites. Nothing the underworld could grab as leverage. Break time, ill fives. Hey, he gave them the water of life and the food of life, and sent them down through the 7 gates like shadows, ran like things that barely registered, nearly invisible. They found Ereshkigal. Story does something here that I think is the reason it has survived 4,000 years and will probably survive 4,000 more. Ereshkigal is in pain. She is groaning over her aching body, over sick women, over sick men, over the dead, over the sheer relentless weight of her duty. It has no end, because death has no end. She is the queen of everything that ends, and she is exhausted by it. She is not triumphant. She is not sinister. Someone who has been given an enormous and terrible responsibility and has carried it alone for longer than the texts bother to measure. These small creatures do not petition her. Break time of fives. They do not argue or demand or threaten. They simply match her. Every groan she makes, they make. Every cry of pain, they echo it. Come her witnesses, her company in the dark, with no agenda beyond presence, no attempt to fix what cannot be fixed or escape what cannot be escaped. They, Ereshkigal, who has apparently never had this before, someone who stayed with her in the dark without wanting something from it, is moved. She offers them a gift. They ask for the corpse on the wall. She gives it. The water of life, the food of life, sprinkled on what remains of Inanna, and Inanna rises. But there is always a condition, and the condition here is structural rather than punitive. The underworld must have its due. 1-1. Someone must replace whoever leaves. This is the rule that predates any individual story about it. Break time 05s. Inanna walks back through the 7 gates, and at each one receives what was taken: the garment, the pectoral, the breastplate, the ring, stones, the rod, the crown. She returns to the upper world, complete. But she returns with the Gala at her side, the demons of the underworld, and they will take whoever she names. She does not name Ninshubar. She does not name her servants who had mourned as instructed. She finds her husband, Dumuzi, seated on his throne in his fine clothes, unbothered, apparently. The texts don't editorialize. They simply describe the posture. Posture speaks, and she gives him the eye of death. Take him. And Dumuzi was taken. Dumuzi's sister, Geshtinana. And I want to be careful here, because this character gets rushed past in most tellings, and I think that's wrong. Break. Timing or fives. I think she's doing something extraordinary. Geshtinana loved her brother so completely that she negotiated. She went to Inanna, and she said, "Let me share it. 6 months he is below, and I am here. 6 months I am below, and he returns. Split it between us. I'll take half." Inanna agreed, and the Sumerians said, "This is why the seasons change. This is why grain grows and is cut, and the field stands bare, and then slowly, stubbornly, the green returns. Because Dumuzi dies and comes back. Because his sister loved him enough to halve the unbearable thing. Because Inanna went into the dark and came out, changed. Because Ereshkigal, in her ancient isolation, accepted company. I need to pause here, boss. What the Sumerians did with this story, embedding it directly into the structure of the natural world, break time 005s, saying, this is the mechanism behind the seasons, what lies behind the thing you watch happen every year. That move deserves a moment. They looked at descent and loss, and the love that negotiates with death. And they said, yes, that explains the world. That is the engine underneath what you see. While steady, the world changes because something went into the dark and came back, and something stayed so something else could go. A heaviness to the descent story that I keep trying to locate precisely and keep almost finding. It's the weight of something true in the body below where thought operates. The recognition that going into the dark, stripped of everything you used to be recognizable, is not the end of being. Sometimes the only available direction is through. Your breath is slow enough. Now, you may have stopped noticing it. Break time 05s. Good. It doesn't need your attention. It knows. Let us speak now of Enlil's wife. Because the origin story of Nana, the moon, one we've just left sailing through the night, is not a clean story, and the Sumerians didn't clean it. Ninlil was young. Her mother, Nanba-Shegunu, old and wise in the specific way the texts mark wisdom. She gave her daughter practical advice. Do not bathe in the canal at Nippur. Do not walk alone along the bank. Enlil is there, and he is powerful, and he looks at you in a way that means something. Some situations are better avoided before they begin. Ninlil went to the canal anyway. The texts don't explain this. Defiance, recklessness, something the story treats as simply having happened, a fact rather than a moral. She went, and Enlil found her, and what followed was not a courtship. Break time equals row 5s. The Sumerians were plain about this. They included it without flinching and without romanticizing it, because they understood that power is large enough and unchecked enough sometimes simply takes. The Divine Assembly judged Enlil for it, exiled him to the underworld, while Ninlil followed him. This is the part I find. I want to say the part I find difficult to describe without misrepresenting. The easy readings are all wrong. She followed, carrying his child, carrying Nana, the moon not yet born. She followed with purpose. Why? She would not let her child's father vanish into the dark while that child was still becoming. Not weakness, and it is not ancient female obligation. And I keep having to hold off the frameworks people reach for here because they don't fit. You went after him with agency, fierce and specific. Break time, fives. On the road to the underworld, Enlil transformed himself into various disguises and encountered her 3 more times. 3 more conceptions. 3 more gods born from these further encounters. Nergal, who would come to rule aspects of the underworld. Ninazu. Enbilulu, lord of canals and rivers. The Sumerians looked at all of this. Power misused, exile. A woman who followed for her own reasons. Children born of circumstances no one would call simple. And they made it the origin of the moon and of the rivers. Anyway, they said, what lies behind the light you navigate by at night? This is what the water you drink comes from. These things exist because of a story that is complicated and does not resolve cleanly. Sumerians were not trying to produce admirable gods in the way that a lesson produces admirable figures. Break time, =5s. They were trying to produce real ones, and real means containing the part that acts well and the part that doesn't, part decepts that is consequences, and the part that puts on a disguise to avoid them, part that follows into the dark because something more important than comfort requires it. So there, Utu was the sun. He crossed the sky daily, chariot or boat, depending on the text, east to west, and then traveled back through the underworld at night, west to east, so he could rise again. This is the bare version, the stated fact, reliable. The most reliable of all of them. Schedule absolute, never absent. It was justice. Sun shines on everything beneath it. It does not choose. Does not distinguish between the wealthy field and the poor one, honored city and the forgotten one. Utu was the patron of judges. Break time, 05s. The enforcer of oaths. When you swore something in Sumer, you swore it by Utu, by the light that sees everything without preference, illuminates without deciding who deserves illumination. And Utu watched those oaths the way the sun watches the earth, which is to say constantly from a position where nothing stays hidden for long. He was Inanna's twin brother. Texts know they were different and depict them with enough specificity that it reads less like literary contrast and more like, I keep thinking the Sumerians were watching something they recognized, full texture of a sibling relationship where one person embodies clarity and the other embodies appetite, and they are bound together by something that predates understanding, something like a sentence that starts before either of them and ends after. Break time, 05s. In the courtship hymns of Inanna and Dumuzi, and these hymns are extraordinary, sensory, in a way that still feels startling. Goddess of desire falling in love, described in detail, that is warm and specific and frankly, good. It is Utu who appears beside her. Her twin tells her the shepherd is worthy. He vouches for Dumuzi. He says, your heart need not be afraid. The sun god, god of impartial light, and the oaths that must be kept, steps sideways from his function for a moment and comforts his sister. I have looked at this with everything I have, he says. What I see is worth trusting. Justice vouches for love. I'm not sure I have anything to add to that. Tried. In several drafts of this, say something about what it means that the most impartial force in the pantheon is also the one who steps in to reassure his sister that her wanting is safe, that the clear-eyed and the burning are not enemies in this cosmology, that they come from the same family, that they cross the same sky in different ways, keeps coming out smaller than the image. Your body is still. The blanket has settled. The room has crossed into the deep part of the night, past the small sounds of a building still active, past the last of the settling and the adjusting. What remains is the sound of a structure at rest, breathing of walls. The oldest stories are still moving at a pace too slow to watch, midpoint. And while you're drifting there between the Sumerian sky and your own ceiling, I want to ask you something. Which of these gods do you recognize? Not which one seems most admirable. One feels familiar. Which one, when you heard it described, produced something in you that was already there, waiting to be named? Enlil, the enormous force that builds and flattens and sometimes acts before it has finished thinking. Is it Enki, break time equal 5Es, that who helps sideways, who finds the gap, who speaks to the wall and lets someone else hear? Is it Inanna, restless and hungry and entirely unapologetic about what she wants? Is it Ereshkigal, ruling a kingdom she didn't choose, carrying the weight of all endings for someone who will just stay without an agenda? Is it Nana, moving through the night, steady and accompanied? Is it Utu, shining on everything equally, watching oaths leave the answer somewhere in the dark? You don't have to say it. The dark already knows. The dark has always been very good at knowing. Bought and steady, there was a king. He stood at the border between history and myth, which is a way of saying we have found enough evidence to know he was real. What? And enough stories to know that the real man had long since been overtaken by what people needed him to mean. Break time, 05s. His name was Gilgamesh. He was 2/3 god, 1/3 human. This sounds like it should be impossible, and it is, mathematically wet, but as a description of experience it is. I find it almost painfully accurate, actually. Be born with gifts so far beyond ordinary scale that the ordinariness still left inside you feels like an insult. Be the most capable person in the room and still mortal. To have everything and still be bounded. He built the walls of Uruk. Big pauses at the very beginning. Before any adventure, before the friendship, before the grief, before any of the things we remember. And it says, go look at the walls. Go walk along them. Look at the brickwork. See how it was done. This is what he built. The text asks you to look before it asks you to listen. Break time equals 05s. I have never been entirely sure why that detail arrests me the way it does, but it does, every time. Also a difficult ruler in the early years. Too much of himself in too small a space. He drove the people of Uruk too hard, claimed too many rights over their lives, was restless with an energy that the city couldn't absorb. The people cried to the gods. The gods made Enkidu from clay, placed him in the wilderness. He ran with animals. He was covered in hair. He didn't know bread, didn't know beer, didn't know fire, or walls, or the experience of looking at another human face and finding something recognizable. It was human nature before civilization organized it into a shape. Strength without form, power without direction. Break time equals or fives. They were brought together through a sequence of events. I'm going to move through quickly because it's long, and I want to get to the part that matters. They met at the gate of Uruk and tested themselves against each other. Strongest man of the civilized world and the strongest being from the wild, and neither won. They were exactly equal, and from the equality, tragedy. From the moment the contest ended in recognition rather than victory, came the friendship, the most consequential friendship in ancient literature. Pause. I need to pause here because I want to be precise about Enkidu, and I keep shortchanging him, the one in this story who actually understands what is coming. He is the one who dreams the underworld. Before he reaches it, describes it to Gilgamesh in detail. Break, time E5s, who tries to give his friend the shape of the thing that is approaching. Gilgamesh is the one who gets the walls at the end, lasting thing, the name. Enkidu gets 12 days of dying and a friend who won't let go. I've never fully resolved how I feel about that distribution. Went into the cedar forest together and killed Humbaba, who guarded it. Humbaba, who was. The texts support several readings here. I'll admit, I find this one the most interesting. Something like the wild itself, Bradeen, the aspect of the world that predated human order and didn't yield to it naturally, that resisted civilization from its own older nature rather than from malice, killed him against the advice of nearly everyone who knew what they were planning. Then Inanna came to Gilgamesh. She proposed herself to him. Time =5s. This is the briefest I will be about Inanna in this entire telling, and I acknowledge that's a choice. Her appearance here is a hinge rather than a dwelling place. She came with the full weight of what she was. Desire itself, the morning star, force that had always eventually gotten what it wanted, and offered herself to the most magnificent king of the most magnificent city in the world. He said no, more than no. He recited to her a list of her previous lovers and what she had done to each of them. The shepherd abandoned, the bird whose wings she broke, the lion she turned into a target. He called her a fire that dies out, a door that keeps out no cold, a shoe that keeps pinching. I do not want to be next on that list, he said. Break time 5s. Dati Inanna. And this tracks perfectly with everything we know about her, was not reflective about this. She went to her father Anu and demanded the bull of heaven, a weapon of cosmic devastation, and she sent it against Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu killed the bull of heaven. And this, the killing of the bull after the killing of Humbaba, was the transgression that couldn't be absorbed. Gods gathered. One of them must die, they said, for going this far, for exceeding what the human portion of a life permits. They chose Enkidu. He died over 12 days. Gilgamesh sat with him for all of it. He held his friend while his friend was taken by something that couldn't be wrestled back, had no body to grab. That was just the going, the continuous going. And Gilgamesh, who was the strongest person alive, break time, 05s, who had killed monsters and faced divine weapons and built the walls that the text wants you to go and look at. He had no tool for this, wept for 7 days and 7 nights, and refused to let Enkidu be buried because burial was admission, and he wasn't ready to admit it yet. And then, with the specificity that great grief always eventually forces out of people, the generality collapsing into one concrete particular, he said, turning into clay. That sentence, after everything, it's turning into clay. Read it many times, and it still does something to me that I can't fully describe, and I've stopped trying. He left Uruk, left the walls, Kochi, walked into the wilderness in animal skins, and he began to look for the one thing he had never needed to look for before. He was looking for immortality anyway. Break 05s. He had heard of Utnapishtim, the man from the flood, the one man who had been granted eternal life by the gods as his reward for surviving, Wanugari, who now lived at the edge of the world, at the place where the sun comes out of the water, Brotedi, past the waters of death that separate the living world from whatever is on the other side. Gilgamesh crossed the mountains. He passed through darkness, convinced a ferryman named Ushanabi, and Ushanabi is another figure I'm moving through too quickly, figure who appears to exist entirely in the service of this moment, Vidi. The man who rose the grief-stricken king across the uncrossable water. He crossed the waters of death and arrived at the place where Utnapishtim lived. Napishtim looked at this magnificent, filthy, devastated king and said, essentially, "What are you doing here?" More gently than that, break time, 5s. But that was the shape of it. You built the walls. You killed the monsters. You were given everything. You've come to this place past the edge of the world because you are afraid to die. And then Utnapishtim said the thing, Unashid di, the sentence that has been moving through philosophy and literature for 4,000 years, like a current under everything, fresh water pressing up through dark. Actually, that's not quite right, more like something left on a table that everyone keeps picking up and turning over. It doesn't move so much as weight, he said. Gods created human beings, they assigned death to humanity, and kept immortality for themselves. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, joyful, day and night. Keep your garments clean. Wash your head. Let the child who holds your hand be happy. Break time, 05s. Let your wife delight in your embrace. These things are the work of human beings. This is the oldest wisdom literature we have, oldest written answer to the question you may have felt tonight, somewhere under everything. What can I hold on to? What lasts? The answer from the only human being who had ever received what Gilgamesh was asking for was the warmth, the clean clothes, the child's hand, the embrace, the food, days themselves. Utnapishtim was not offering consolation. He was not saying, settle, he was saying, and I've spent more time with this passage than I probably should admit. We're trying to get the weight of it right. He was saying that mortality and presence arrived together as a single gift. Gods understood what they were giving away when they gave it. Break time, 0.05s. That immortality and the ability to be fully in a moment do not easily coexist, and the gods knew this when they made the arrangement. It was still the plant. Utnapishtim told him about a plant at the bottom of the sea, the plant of heartbeat, thing of youth restored. Gamesh dove for it with his hands and pulled it up from the bottom, bleeding and dripping, and he held it. A snake took it while he slept, came up, smelled the plant, took it, and shed its skin as it left, which is why the Sumerians said snakes can renew themselves and we cannot. Gilgamesh woke to absence, down, wept again, got up, came home. The epic ends where it opened. Look at the walls, walk along them, see the brickwork, see what a human life bounded, mortal, grief split, particular, can leave behind. The walls, the story. This story, break time, equals. If fives, moving through the dark towards you, 4,000 years later, still arriving, and here the story asks a question it cannot answer. Maybe you already felt it. In the particular weight of the dark tonight, the specific way the blanket sits across your chest, steady, the way the mind goes quiet when the body finally stops, and then, in that quiet, doesn't produce peace, exactly, but something more like honesty, thing that's actually here. Gilgamesh went looking for the thing that would prevent loss. What he found was the walls. What he found was the story. What he found was the return to this city, the people, the mortal bounded life that had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for him to come back to it. But have you ever thought about what it cost him to know that? What it costs, in general, break time fives, to go all the way to the edge of the world, to look out over the waters of death, to hear the oldest living man say, the child's hand brace the days, and then turn around and walk back. Not because you found what you came for, because you found something that makes what you came for look like the wrong question, and you almost missed it. Now you have to carry the knowledge of how close you came to missing it forever. That is a heavy thing to bring back through the mountains. Or that is a heavy thing to set down next to walls you built before you understood why building things matters. I don't have an answer to that. I don't think it has one. I think it's the question sitting at the bottom of every Sumerian tablet, under the flood story, the creation story, the desire story, the descent, break time, fives. I think it's what Ereshkigal was asking in her moaning. What Enlil was trying to solve by making the world go quiet. Fate. What Inanna was reaching toward when she walked through the 7 gates and let everything be taken from her. Cost to know that the life you have is the life that matters. Sit with that. Let it stay unresolved. The dark has patience for unresolved things. There were other gods, so many other gods, that any single telling is already a kind of failure, a betrayal of the fullness of what the Sumerians imagined, worshipped, carried in their minds when they walked through a world that was, to them, entirely inhabited. And I want to be careful here, because the word inhabited does a lot of work that's easy to collapse. This wasn't metaphor, break time, 05s. It wasn't the way a modern person might say a landscape is alive, meaning rich, meaningful, aesthetically resonant. It was literal. Every reed bed and river bend. Every wind that turned a different direction than the one you predicted. Every fire that refused to light on the morning you needed it most. Every dream that came in the third hour of the night with a clarity that felt like instruction. All of it was occupied. All of it was a being, or a message from a being, or a sign that a being had passed through. Nisaba was the goddess of grain and writing, shown in the hymns holding a lapis lazuli tablet and a gold stylus. She wore the stars as a crown. She was the patron of scribes, of those who pressed marks into clay, who found a way to make memory solid. Break time equals 05s, who took the ephemeral fact of a day's trade, or a king's deed, or a prayer's precise wording, and made it permanent enough to outlast the mouth that first spoke it. The patron of what I'm doing right now. In some sense, I find hard to fully articulate. Of what you're listening to, the ancient need to take what happens and make it, not immortal, that's the wrong word, it durable enough to pass on. Nisaba would not be surprised by you, would recognize you instantly. Someone lying in the dark, listening to a voice, tell old stories into the night. She would understand that, indeed. She would understand that this is what people have always done. All my head, finding a way to be a little less alone inside a world that is too large and too strange and too beautiful and too painful to be anything other than storied. She might offer you, maybe, break Team 5s, the kindness of her gold stylus. She might say, you are already writing. Every moment of attention is a mark in the clay. While Nergal ruled the underworld alongside Ereshkigal. Eventually, the story of how he got there is one of the strangest in the whole canon, and I keep returning to it. I'm not entirely sure why, something in it that I can't. Anyway, he was invited to a divine feast but couldn't attend, so he sent his minister instead. Minister committed an offense against Ereshkigal at the feast. Ereshkigal demanded satisfaction. Nergal was brought to the underworld to face judgment when he and Ereshkigal met, and found in each other something neither had expected, something that disrupted the whole shape of why he was there. Break time 05s. They spent 7 days together in the underworld before the gods above noticed Nergal hadn't returned. When the messenger came, Projid, Nergal had to be retrieved, had to be escorted back to the world above, because otherwise he would have simply stayed. And then Ereshkigal, alone again in the underworld, wrote a message to the divine assembly. The texts preserve it. She wrote, Nergal, does not love me. My childhood, I have not known the joy of playing with other girls. Since my childhood, I have not known the love of young men. Showed me something I had never seen, and now he is gone, and I will not rest. I will raise the dead to eat the living unless I have him back. The gods, with that ultimatum, sent Nergal back. He stayed Ereshkigal, who had killed Inanna with a look and hung her on a hook, time equals 05s, who had moaned alone in her kingdom until Enki's small creatures came and witnessed her grief, was not alone anymore. A tenderness in this that is almost unbearable if you let it be. The Queen of Death wanted love and used the only leverage she had. What she had was the threat of annihilation, and she used it, and it worked. What she really said was, I did not know this was possible. Now that I know it exists, I cannot unknow it, and I will ruin everything I can reach if I am made to be without it again. When the universe, in the form of the divine assembly, which is a strange phrase, like a board meeting of the infinite, said, fine, stay, you can have that, pause here. These stories accumulate in a way that's hard to track without losing the thread. Let me find it again. Ninurta was the warrior, Break Tam 5's son of Enlil. He wielded the Shurur, a divine weapon that was itself a being, a mace that could speak, could fly, quarried, carried messages between gods, and reported on enemy movements. He fought the monster Asag in the mountains, creature of disease and darkness that had claimed the high peaks for itself. Ninurta defeated it. From the stones of that defeated mountain built a wall, a mountain range to direct the spring flood waters south towards Sumer. So the rivers would fill, so the fields would drink, so there would be harvest. He structured the world's hydrology with the body of the thing he killed. The victory was martial, and then immediately agricultural. Killed the thing that threatened the world and used its remains to make the world work better. He didn't stand over the body of Asag and celebrate, for he arranged the stones. Break time equals 05s. This is how the Sumerians understood heroism. Force as a tool of order, destruction in service of construction. The hero doesn't only defeat, the hero reshapes the aftermath of the defeat into something that feeds people. Anyway, Sumerians believed everything in the world had a destiny, a fate, a name that was also its essence. Destiny of a tree was to grow in a particular direction, a river to move toward the sea. Human beings' destiny was written on the tablet of fate and held by An at the apex of the heavens. But, and this matters, it wasn't fixed the way the word fate tends to imply now. It could be petitioned, altered, by the right prayer at the right moment, offered by someone sufficiently persistent or sufficiently beloved or sufficiently clever. The world was a conversation. Pipe, break 5s. Deep prayer was participation in that conversation. Temple was where the conversation was formalized, where the community's voice was concentrated and directed upward through the priest or priestess standing at the threshold between human and divine, saying, this is what we need, this is what we're offering. This is why the exchange is fair. Enheduanna was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, priestess of Nanna in Ur, the earliest named author in human history. She wrote prayers to Inanna, wrote them when she had no other options. She had been driven from her office by a usurper, exiled from the temple, removed from the divine presence she had spent her life serving. She sat in her exile and wrote. She wrote, "What is this to you? You who are mightier than all things, you who are the light of morning. Look at me, I was your servant." Breaks, 0.5s. I held the lapis lazuli measuring rod. I walked before you. Look at where I am now. She was not performing gratitude. She was writing to a being she believed was real, with the full weight of her grief and her need. And she was saying, "Notice me. Do something." Was restored to her office, steady, whether through divine intervention or through the kind of political shift that looks, if you believe in gods, very much like divine management. She came back, resumed her role, kept writing. Her hymns to Inanna were copied and recopied in the scribal schools for centuries after her death. They became teaching texts. Ronani, the way you learn to write, in part, is by copying the words of those who wrote before you. O Enheduanna's voice, her anger and devotion and precision, and her willingness to make her need explicit in the presence of a god, was reproduced in the hands and the education of scribes for generations. Her words were the first words. Many Sumerian scribes wrote. Her prayer was the first prayer many of them copied. She taught thousands of people to write by teaching them her own cry for help. There isn't a tidy thing to say after that. I kept writing it expecting to find one, and I didn't. Some modern reflex almost surfaces here, something about the word relatable, but no, that's not it, not anywhere close. Let the words move over you now the way water moves. Not urgent, not asking for anything. Queen of Death wanted love and threatened to end the world to get it. The warrior built hydrology from the body of a monster. A high priestess wrote her most honest prayer from exile. The oldest man alive told the greatest hero that the clean clothes and the child's hand were the point. Break time 0.05s. The sentences are getting shorter now. That's what happens. The dark outside the window, the blanket. You still hear the stars. Sumerians were beings, each one, each constellation, a god or a servant of a god. What? And the movements of the heavens were the movements of the divine community, the assembly in session, the court in motion, vast governmental machinery of the universe conducting its business in the sky above the city, while the city slept or didn't sleep below, steady. When Venus rose before the sun, Inanna was arriving. When the moon was full, Nanna was at the height of his power, his light most generous. Particular star appeared on the horizon at a particular season. It was a message, and I want to be careful here, cause this is the part that's easiest to flatten into something like astrology, break time, 0.05s, which is wrong, which misses the whole civic weight of it. It was a message in the sense of a government dispatch, report from the divine assembly. This is what is happening. at the level of heaven. Prepare accordingly. The priests who watched the sky were diplomats already. Reading the movements of a government, they could observe but not fully join, relaying those movements to the people below who needed to know what the gods were currently doing in order to live well in response. Stars were dispatch, not decoration, not comfort, not the beautiful, indifferent backdrop that they became later in other traditions, and then later still in ours, where we look up and feel small and moved and then go inside. For the Sumerians, the sky was the primary reality. The cities were the response to it. Break, time, 0.05s. The Ziggurats were built tall, so the distance between the two could be shortened, if only by a little, if only symbolically, only enough to make the conversation feel possible. Ereshkigal had a son. His name was Ninazu, and he was a god of healing. Sat with that fact longer than I expected to when I first encountered it. That healing should come from the underworld, but the child of the Queen of Death should be the one who knows how to bring people back from the edge of dying. Except it makes a kind of sense that I find hard to put into words without ruining it. Brinji, the physician who has looked at death, is a better physician than one who hasn't. The healer, who knows what happens when healing fails, understands the stakes in a way that can't be taught from the other side. Ninazu, born in the dark to the Queen of the Dark, break time. 0.05s carried in his work the full weight of what he was working against. He knew the alternative. He had grown up in it, healed because he knew. This is also. Let me collect this carefully. It matters. This is also why Inanna's descent means more than the surface of it. It is a story about the necessity of going down, about the things that can only be learned in the dark, about a transformation that the light cannot produce, requires the stripping, the humiliation, the hook on the wall, the 3 days of stillness. The small fingerprint creatures who came and witnessed cannot become what you are capable of becoming without the version of the descent that belongs to you. Out. The moment when everything you have used to locate yourself is removed, one thing at a time, gate by gate, break time, 05s, until you are standing in some interior place without anything left to prove who you are. And then something comes, brings you the water of life, the food of life. You rise. You go back through the gates. At each gate, you receive back what was taken. You come back different, and the ascent has to find room for what the descent changed. Return with your crown and your measuring rod and your garment. They fit. They feel different. You know now what it is to be without them. So there, let me collect the thread here. I've been moving fast through some of this, and I want to slow down for what comes next, because it asks for it. Ningle, Moon's wife, Lady of the Great Lake. She appears in a lament that is one of the most devastating documents in all of ancient literature. Break, time, equal 5s. And I'm going to say that plainly without performing it, because the performance would be a betrayal of what it actually is. Meant is for Nanna's city. It was destroyed by the Amorites by the Elamites, by the collapse of the Third Dynasty, by whatever instrument history chose at that particular moment, and the priests who survived wrote the lament afterward and put the words in Ningal's mouth. She had gone before the assembly, before An, before Enlil. She had pleaded for her city. She said, "I will do anything. Change the decree." An said no. Lil said no. The decree stood. The destruction would come. The flood, as metaphor, as the city's end, would come when Ningal said something. "I haven't found an equivalent to anywhere else," she said. Since the decree of An could not be changed, break time, 0.05s. Since the command of Enlil could not be abandoned, I sought out what would soothe Enlil's heart. I was the one who approved the destruction of my own city. She approved it to make peace with the inevitable, stop fighting what had already been decided, and find in the acceptance some final small form of agency. She became complicit in her city's ruin because the alternative was to be only its helpless witness. Between those two, helpless witness and reluctant accomplice, she chose the one that let her remain a participant in the world's unfolding, when what the world was unfolding was her own loss. Then she sat and watched it happen and wept. Divinity was not immunity. This is the thing. God suffered. The gods lost what they loved. Ningal, this vast divine being, wife of the moon, break time, equals, pro fives, a queen of the great celestial boat that traveled the sky, sat in the middle of her burning city and was exactly as helpless as any person who has ever sat beside something they could not save. She had loved the city. She had loved the people in it. And the people were dying and fleeing, and the buildings were coming down, and she wept the whole story. She wept, saying yes to the bond the Sumerians understood, means eventually saying yes to the loss as what it costs to love a mortal thing with an immortal heart. And something almost surfaces here, something about how we know the text holds its own, doesn't need the modern gloss. Anyway, Dumuzi returned every spring, the shepherd god, Inanna's husband, the one taken to the underworld in her place, split his time there with his sister, Geshtinanna, break time, 05s, each of them descending so the other could rise. And when Dumuzi rose, the growing season rose with him. Lambs in the fields, grain on the stalk, green across the earth that had been bare. I'll be honest, I tend to rush through the seasonal mythology because it risks feeling schematic, like myth doing its most obvious work. God goes down, winter comes back spring. Fine, I know, but the Sumerians did something with Dumuzi's return that I find I can't actually rush past, which is that they mourned his absence every autumn, formally, collectively. As a ritual occasion, they understood that grief was the precondition of renewal. You had to feel the loss of the green before you could fully receive the return of the green. You had to go through the cold months, the bare months, break time equals 05s, the months of waiting. And you had to go through them together, weeping together for the absent God, recognizing that you were surrounded by people who were also waiting. the loss shared, therefore bearable, in a way that private loss is often not. Boozy returned. He always returned. They knew he would. They mourned anyway, because the return is the gift. The mourning is the truth of the bond. Two facts. Move on. In Eridu, the most ancient city, the one the Sumerians said was first, the one where An descended when civilization was established. In Eridu, his temple stood at the edge of the water. The Abzu, the house of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the world, was its foundation. Enki lived there, water, and the water was his mind. Break time equals 0.05s. The fresh water that rose through wells and springs and filled the irrigation channels was his thought coming to the surface. Wisdom moving up through the earth and expressing itself as the thing that made grain grow and bodies continue. He was never entirely dry, white. I don't know why that detail keeps holding me, but it does. The image of a god whose presence in the world is always wet, always the feeling of. The canal, bring, the river's edge, putting your hands into cool water on a hot day and feeling, for a second, that the world intends you to feel this spot. Like something large and unhurried noticed you were thirsty. He gave humanity agriculture, brick-making, the domestication of animals, metallurgy, crafts of the leather worker, the woodworker, and then the last items on the list start to feel like listing. For listings' sake, break time equal 5s. They go faster in the sources, more dutiful, the weaver. He gave language. He gave the incantation, the words that, spoken correctly, changed the nature of a situation, could protect, could heal, could request, gave the rituals that organized the human, divine relationship into something practicable, something that could be passed down, something a child could be taught. He gave the structure of the conversation, the world. The Sumerians kept insisting was a conversation. Enki was the one who gave humanity the words moving through the dark toward you, still arriving. He was the god of the teachable bond, the god of what passes from one generation to the next. And I want to sit with that for a moment before moving on, because passes is too gentle, a word for what actually happens, which is more like pressing, break time, 0.05s, more like the weight of a hand on a shoulder saying, here, hold this, it matters, someone gave it to me, and now I'm giving it to you. Living transmission, the knowledge that reaches you already warm from the hands that carried it before yours. You are the beneficiary of Enki's gifts. Actually, want. The words you know, the techniques that structure your daily life, crafts and practices you use without thinking about where they came from. These were handed to you by a chain of teaching that begins, most ancient end, with people who believed these skills had been given to them by a god who lived at the bottom of the freshwater deep. And tonight, telling and the listening, that too. That also goes back. There is a story about how Uruk got its particular combination of divine gifts. Break time 05s. Toni Nana went to visit Enki in his house at the bottom of the water, and she was, as always, every story she appears in, looking for more, than she currently had. She drank with him. Cups of beer, the ritual drinks of a divine meeting. And as the drinking went on and the night deepened, Enki began to give things away. He gave her the Enship, the sacred office, gave her the descent into the underworld and the ascent from it. He gave her the art of lovemaking and the art of kissing, gave her the art of prostitution and the office of eunuch. He gave her the power of perverting and the art of straightening. He gave her the scribal art, blacksmith's art, the leather worker's art, the mason's art. Gave her music making and heroism and power and enmity and straightness and the going sideways when straight was expected. Break time equals 05s. He gave and gave and gave. The texts produce a long list, and scholars have spent real time on it, deciphering and cataloging, and I find I can't fully convey the cumulative weight of that list in summary. You have to encounter it yourself to feel the absurdity of its generosity, the way it just keeps going. One more thing, one more office, one more art. Here, take this too. Inanna received all of it, every single thing, quite. Loaded it onto her boat. In the morning, Enki woke, and this is the part I find I can't stop thinking about. The morning after quality of it, God, who had given away the contents of his storeroom, and now had to face what that meant. He sent his minister to look in the storage room. What is missing? Everything, the minister said. The lady has taken everything. Enki sent his sea monsters after her. His retinue, break time, fives. Pay one after another, each sent to recover what had been given. Inanna faced each one down and sailed on. Bride. She arrived at Uruk with everything still in her arms and gave it to her city. And the people of Uruk received the arts and the offices and the powers of civilization as gifts from a goddess who had carried them across the water through every obstacle sent to stop her. She didn't give them easily gotten things. She gave them things she had been chased over open water for. Things that, by the time they arrived, had been proven valuable by the chase itself. This is Inanna, the one for whom wanting is active, experiencing desire, but pursuing its object until the object is secured and given away. She brought civilization to Uruk in her arms, across the water, there. And what did the people of Uruk do with it? Break time 0.05s. They built, they wrote, they sang, argued and traded and raised children and mourned the dead and celebrated the festivals and watched the sky and planted the grain and waited for the rain. And sometimes the rain came and sometimes it didn't. And they lived through both, developed cuneiform, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. And with it, they first wrote down the prices of fish and barley, receipts of a trading civilization, the practical and unromantic beginnings of what became the world's most transformative technology. And then, eventually, wrote the prayers. Then the stories, then the hymns. The chain going forward, each link assuming the last. And Enheduanna sat in exile and wrote to Inanna, I am your servant and I am suffering. Notice me. And Inanna noticed, I need to pause here. Break time 0.05s. Something about that, Inanna noticing, keeps stopping me every time I arrive at it, and I'm not entirely sure I can explain why. May just be the economy of it. That after everything she is, everything the mythology assigns her, the descent, the theft of the me, the war rage, morning star, the desire that reorganizes kingdoms. After all of that, the thing that the story chooses to end on is that she turned and looked. He noticed her servant. Maybe that's not interesting to anyone else. I kept it. The sentences are long now. They find the low places and spread like actually. I don't have the right comparison for this. Something about water finding the shape of the land beneath it, late, and the simile keeps slipping sideways before it seals. Let it go. You know what I mean. You may be at the edge of sleep, break time equal 5s. That is exactly where this story wants you. At the edge, the waking mind still listens, but the dreaming mind has already started making its own associations, populating the dark with its own figures. The gods come with you. Let Nana and his celestial boat find the surface of your closed eyes. Enki speak from the bottom of whatever water your dreaming mind provides. Nana stand at the gate and refuse to give anything more up tonight. She has given enough. She gave it all once already. She carried it across open water. Done. Let Ereshkigal find Nurgle. In whatever underworld your sleeping mind constructs, let it be the 7 days that feel like the beginning of something. Break time equals wives. A5s. Let Gilgamesh come back through the mountains and stop on the road and look at the walls he built before he understood why building things mattered. Actually feel it. Anyway, there was a tree. In the oldest versions of the Inanna stories, a tree called the Hulupu growing on the banks of the Euphrates. In its roots, a serpent had made its home. In its trunk, the Abzu bird had nested, a great and dangerous creature, the one that stole the tablets of destiny from the gods in another story entirely. And in its branches, Lilith had built her house. Inanna wanted the tree. We wanted to cut it down and make from its wood a throne and a bed, the symbols of her power and her love. But the tree was occupied, and she couldn't move the occupants. She wept. Gilgamesh came. He put on his armor, bronze, is 50 shekels in weight, break time, 0.05s, which I include, because the sources include it, and because there's something in the specificity that feels important. 50 shekels. And he drove out the serpent, and drove out the Abzu bird, and drove out Lilith, and he cut down the tree, and gave it to Inanna. From the roots she made a drum. From the fallen branches of the crown she made its beater. She played it in the streets of Uruk. The city celebrated. Drum fell into the underworld, fell through, gone. She wept again. Gilgamesh went down for it. In some texts, a smaller descent than Inanna's, decorated, less mythologically loaded, and I'll be honest, I tend to move through it faster than it perhaps deserves, cause it sits in the shadow of her descent and suffers the comparison. But it carries the same logic. You go down for what matters. Break time, 0.05s. You don't accept the loss of what matters just because reversing the loss is hard. And even if you come back empty-handed, even if the drum stays below, the going was the right answer. The effort was the correct expression of the value. Go, because you valued it enough to go. Ninhursag was the mother. Among the oldest of the great deities, did in the earliest texts, alongside An and Enlil and Enki, as one of the four primary gods from whom everything else derived. Lady of the foothills, she shaped living things and brought them into the world. She and Enki had a history. Of course they did. Paradise Garden of Dilmun, a place the Sumerians imagined as an original purity, a world before hunger and illness, before the complication civilization introduced break time X05s, which, when you think about it, is a strange thing for a civilization to imagine. The world before itself, blankness before the city. They played out a story of desire and transgression and consequence. Enki ate the plants Ninhursag had grown. She cursed him, sickened. 8 parts of him failing, one by one, each organ a separate and specific pain. The gods sent the fox to find Ninhursag and bring her back. Only she could undo what she had done. She came back. She healed him. The texts are direct about how Sumerian divine world was not squeamish about the body, any part of it. The body was the medium of everything. Creation, suffering, desire, war, death, turn. The place where divinity and mortality met most directly, where the story became real. And Ninhursag healed Enki through the body, brought forth from her own body a healing deity for each of his ailing parts, one by one, until he was whole. She healed him because the world needed them both. Web with a broken strand doesn't hold the same as it did. She healed the one who had offended her because he was also beloved, also connected, also part of the structure that made everything else possible. She healed him. That's the whole sentence. The world needed them both. That's the other one. There isn't more to say tonight. Chain of teaching that began at the bottom of the freshwater. Deep runs through every word spoken here, through every hand that pressed a stylus into clay to copy Enheduanna's cry for help, through every scribe who learned to write by writing someone else's grief, through the dark between that flat land, between 2 rivers, and the room where you are lying now. Enki's house is below. The water rises. Pos, you're already receiving it. Somewhere in the dark of your room, the night has passed its deepest point. You probably don't know this, body. The body knows it before the mind does. Some small shift in the quality of the dark, a marginal change that isn't visible yet, but is already there. Break. Its point. 05's the way. Light begins to alter the air a long time before the eye can register any alteration. The body knows. Mind is still somewhere else. You too is preparing. Far beyond the horizon, far beyond the edge of what imagination can actually reach. If you try to reach it honestly, the sun is making its slow way back through the underworld toward the place where it will rise again, and the light will return, and the working day will resume, and all the ordinary, particular, urgent demands of a living life will come back and ask for your attention. Yet, but coming, always coming, the way Dumuzi always returns, the way Inanna always ascends, the way Gilgamesh always comes back through the mountains to the walls, the way the moon goes through its dark and comes back to fullness. Break time equals 0 5s. The way spring comes back every year to the fields that have been cold and waiting and don't, so far as we know, ever stop waiting. Return is always coming. And while it is still night, while the return is still ahead rather than arrived, there is this, the dark, the quiet, the blanket, breath moving in and out at a pace that belongs entirely to the body and nothing else. The breath that doesn't need to be managed, breath that has been doing this since before you knew how to name it. In the beginning was not chaos, or, I need to be careful here, cause this is the sentence that most wants to become the wrong kind of impressive. The Sumerian word for the original state of the world was a word for totality, for completeness, for the state in which everything that would become distinct had not yet become distinct. Break time 5s. Everything. Present. Nothing separated. Nothing yet in relationship. Because relationship requires two things, and there was only one thing, was everything. An was heaven. Ki was earth. In the beginning they were together, undivided, not yet, in the dialogue that creates space and meaning, and the possibility of a story having somewhere to happen. And Enlil, the wind, the breath between things, paraded them. He lifted and upward. He pressed Kai downward. In the space the breath created, the world became possible. Creation was separation. Dedi, the making of a gap, opening of space in which all things could differentiate themselves from all other things, in which a tree could become a tree rather than part of everything, which a person could become a person rather than part of the undivided whole. You were created by separation. 2. Break time equals 0 5s. Hide. By the moment when you became distinct, when the boundaries of your particular body were declared, and you were sent, breathing, the world of differentiated things. Find I keep returning to this image when I think about the Sumerian cosmology. Keep returning to it more than the scholarship perhaps requires, because there is something in the equation between that first cosmic breath and the first breath of a body being born that refuses to stay merely poetic, feels structural. Like the same act at different scales, breath that separated An from Ki is the same kind of act as the breath that opened your lungs for the first time. And death, understanding. Death is the return, the going back into the totality from which the separation was made, the de-differentiation. The Sumerians grieved this fully, unashamedly. Break time equal 5s, without dressing it in consolation. The great dark city below was not a paradise to them, but they understood it, part of the same structure, the same story that begins with Enlil lifting the sky. Breath opened the world. Breath closes it. Let me collect the thread here. I want to get the ending right because it matters, and I've been building toward it for longer than one night. Between the opening and the closing, everything, the moon and the sun and the morning star, the rivers, the walls, the cedar forests, descent and the return, the drum, the tree, the serpent in the roots, the bird in the branches, the friend who turns into clay, and the walls that remain, the oldest man alive, and the plant of heartbeat, and the snake that came up out of the water while the hero slept. Break time. 05's the queen of death, wanting love and threatening annihilation to get it. The high priestess in exile, writing her anger into clay, in between the thing. Anyway, this story found you somewhere tonight. If the voice of the oldest world carried you part of the way across the dark to where the sleep is deep, then know this: there are more gods. There are always more gods in Sumer. It is one of the things about the tradition that I find genuinely inexhaustible. I am someone who has spent a considerable amount of time with it, and I am still finding gods I hadn't properly met before, still finding a hymn or a lament or a mythological fragment that reframes something I thought I had understood. More descents and returns, more floods survived, more cities built. Break time equals odd. 5's, more hymns written in exile by people who would not stop writing even when everything they had worked toward was taken. The next story is there. Waiting the way spring waits behind the winter, the way Dumuzi waits behind the cold months. Way the walls waited for Gilgamesh to come home and look at them and understand for the first time. Actually understand in his body the way you can only understand something after you've almost lost the capacity to see it. What he'd built. To be there for it, all you have to do is return. The weight stay beneath the blanket. Let the dark do what the dark does. Let the gods keep their stations. Nana in his boat, or Itu somewhere in the underworld passage, making his way back. Inanna at whatever gate she currently stands at, in my experience of these stories, is always some gate. Break time equal point 05's. Always some threshold. She is never simply at rest in the middle of things, always arriving or departing or about to. And somewhere there's a thought about how that maps onto something recognizable in the living world. Late, and I'll leave it there. Enki in the fresh water, deep beneath the earth, speaking quietly to the walls of things, telling them what is coming, trusting that someone is listening on the other side. Ereshkigal at rest, Nurgle beside her. The long ago ultimatum fulfilled. 7 days that were the beginning of something. Gilgamesh standing at the walls, taking his time. The story not yet requiring anything else of him. Dinana going down in her brother's place, as she does, as she has, particular. I want to find the right word and keep choosing wrong ones, with a particular quality of someone who has chosen a hard thing because someone she loves is waiting on the other side of it, as close as I can get. Nisaba holding the lapis lazuli tablet and the gold stylus. The marks already made, standing as they are, permanent record of what happened and what was hoped and what was feared and what was sung. In the temples and pressed into clay in the cities between the rivers in the land that is gone, and the story that never stopped. All of it be exactly what it is. 3 things. The oldest story, the dark room. You good night.